Hi, everyone, and I guess welcome to another Tuesdays at 2. Today, we're going to be talking about nonviolent communication, but we're going to specifically answer 3 questions. The first one, what is nonviolent communication? The second one, um, why is nonviolent communication important? And what are some of the ways that it is important? And then the third question is, how can nonviolent communication help us process our thoughts and our feelings, our needs, requests that we have surrounding specifically more complex conflicts? Because as we will see, nonviolent communication is one method of resolving conflict among other methods. It's not the only one. And the reason I say complex conflict is because, of course, life is kind of complicated. And sometimes conflicts that are either interpersonal or even within ourselves or much larger between groups of people or between nations is often very complicated. And when we go about wanting to talk about that with other people, we want to really be clear about not only what is going on for us, but then what is maybe going on for the other person, which is why NVC or nonviolent communication is important. So let's come to terms. As I once read in a very interesting book, what is nonviolent communication? What are the ways that we can define this? So I should say that nonviolent communication was developed by the former and late psychologist Dr. Marshall Rosenberg in around the 60s. That's when he formally wrote it all down. And he ended up writing books about it, and then he opened the Center for Nonviolent Communication. But what is it? What is he bringing the world? And so essentially, nonviolent communication is a method of communication that leads us to give from the heart. This is Marshall's definition. You can find this on the Center for NVC website. You can find this in any book that he's written. This is how he defines it. Basically, a way of communicating that allows us to give to one another from our heart. And so what he wants to say in that is, by communicating in this way that we will go over, we want to serve life. We want to basically give to that which promotes life. And I don't mean procreation. I mean life as the energy source of feeling alive, it's kind of hard to explain. But in other words, it shouldn't deplete you. You should ideally feel like you want to give more. You feel like you've got it. And this hopefully will create connection between you and the other people, or connection even to yourself, connection to what is going on in you, so that the end result being the outcome is to meet not only what you need or want, but also others, that it's an interdependent, and I stress interdependent, way of basically getting everyone what they want or what they need, what they value, what they would prefer, those kinds of things. And I make that distinction because some of the criticism towards NVC is that it can be misinterpreted as being this selfish mode of communication, when in fact it's literally the opposite of that. So that's what NVC is, and let's look at maybe what the process is. How does one go about doing this? And why, additionally, is it also called conscious communication? And Rosenberg defined it as kind of a conscious communication because he found that as people were developing an understanding of what was going on for them and other people, they were becoming more conscious. They were becoming more aware of what's going on for them and what's going on for others. So that's why he sometimes called it conscious communication. And we have to remember that Rosenberg's context at least academically, was one of psychology, one of comparative religious studies. I'm not sure that it was comparative theology, which is a separate thing. I should know, I have 2 degrees in theology. He looked at it as comparative religious studies, and those 2 things, the psychology and the comparative religious studies, helped him develop what we now call nonviolent communication, which led him to think about these things in terms of consciousness. So why would someone even decide, I'm into this NVC thing, let's see what this could do? Why? Because if we think about NVC as a conscious communication, one where we are aware of what's going on, that makes us wonder, well, could we have been communicating in ways that perhaps distance us from what was going on or distance us from other people? And yes, that is the case. And so prior to NVC, ways of communicating can sound like a hierarchy-based way of communicating, where you're thinking about people and structures and systems in terms of hierarchy, or a judgmental kind of you're here and I'm here, i.e. racism, sexism, classism, all the isms you can think of is hierarchy, because that suggests that the way we are thinking about one another, then therefore the way that we are then communicating with one another, does not allow for the meeting of 2 people as human beings, but rather we're thinking of them in terms of this hierarchy. Well, your job is this, my job is this, my role is this, your role is that, therefore I will treat you accordingly. And you can see how this can lead to a lot of problems. Again, racism, sexism, fill in the blankism, ableism, saneism, all those things contribute to this way of communicating that's, well, violent. So what happens if we say, okay, I need another way. I want to go about this a different way. Enter NVC. What then happens? What happens is we can choose the way we communicate. We can become aware of what we're thinking, what we're feeling, what we need, how we want to go about getting those needs met, i.e. the way that we make requests, which are different than demands, and we will get to that in a second. What also happens is that when we are more conscious of what we're thinking and what we're saying and what we're feeling, we begin to see things as choices that happen in the moment. So like each and every moment, we can think, okay, what am I thinking about the situation? What am I telling myself about this situation or this person or this event or this fill in the blank? And how am I feeling right now? Not how am I feeling if I think about this for 20 minutes, or how am I feeling based on what somebody told me about the situation, but how am I feeling in this moment? So then you're getting in touch with your feeling. And then that points, according to Rosenberg, that points to what you then need or desire or want or prefer. And then out of that need, which Rosenberg says is the absolute cornerstone of NVC, it's not so much about feelings, because you can kind of go back and forth with feelings, but if you don't get to the core need of like, what is it I'm actually wanting, you can't then ask either yourself or other people for things that will then meet that need or contribute to that value, whatever that is. And that takes a moment to moment awareness that requires us to sort of slow down and realize, okay, I'm having a lot of feelings about this thing because I'm thinking this, which is tapping into your consciousness, tapping into what you are telling yourself. Therefore, you can then say, okay, so now I realize I'm needing something and I want to go about getting it. So that's what can happen after we study NVC, hopefully. And so what this leads to, this moment by moment consciousness, leads to a form of what I'm calling a liberation. It's liberating because no longer are you confined by the hierarchical, you have to do this because somebody said it 1,000 years ago, or you have to think this way because that's the way it is. That's the way society is. You can break free, you can essentially liberate, and you suddenly see that, oh, you mean I can actually make a decision for myself? Yes, yes. So that's very liberating in my estimation. So through this, what ends up happening is that we begin to see that, oh, we're effectively living out empathy. Now, empathy, I realize, has 1,000,001 definitions. So let me pinpoint Rosenberg's definition of empathy so that we can center on the context in which it is used here. So Rosenberg defines empathy as the respectful understanding of what another person is experiencing. That can also be self-empathy as the respectful understanding of what you are going through. What are you experiencing? So it's both ways, and I want to emphasize that because I also want to make sure that NVC is understood as a process that is not all about sacrificial serving of others, but it is an interdependent self-care as well as the care of others way of thinking and communicating. And I make that caveat because I think sometimes when we learn about compassion and we learn about empathy and we learn about nonviolence, we're often told that these things require that we give up all of who we are because we have to give to everyone else, and suddenly we're burnt out. And of course, Rosenberg did not ever subscribe to that, and he would never have wanted anyone else to, which is a large part of why he created this process. So I just want to make sure that's really clear. This is both a self-care, a self-compassion, as well as compassion for others. So now that we know that. And so empathy, therefore, is this give and take. Self-empathy is what's going on for me. Empathy is what is going on for you, or what is going on for this group of people, what's going on for this other nation. And that will get important when we realize why NVC is important and how it can help us with more complex conflicts. So keep that in the back of your mind. In thinking about empathy, I'm reminded of the South African proverb, a person becomes a person through other people. In other words, we alone cannot fix it. If I'm quoting anybody you know, you know. If you know, you know. And what this also means is we don't just get what we want for selfish reasons. We get what we need, others get what they need through other people. And we are constantly in community, in solidarity, helping one another. Everyone's meeting everyone else's needs. And this contributes to this interdependence that I keep talking about. That's going to become important later on as well. So what is the framework of NVC? Now, I know some of you may be familiar with it. You may have taken workshops, you may have read the books, you may have seen the videos. You may know everything about NVC. For those of you who don't, the framework is quite simple. You begin with your observation, which I'm going to differentiate in a second. You then move to the feeling. Also, going to have some differentiations. After your feeling, you figure out what your need is. And by need, I can mean wants, values, desires, preferences. The list sort of goes on. It's not just one word. And then after that, once you figure out the need, you then move to your request. And there's a reason why request is used versus just asking for what you want. Excuse me. Again, I will differentiate in a second. So that's the overall framework: observation, feeling, need, request. So observations. What is an observation? An observation is something like, well, let me give you the real definition. Observation is, what did you see, hear, touch? Because of course some can't see, some can't hear. We want to be sensitive to all forms of experience. What effectively did you experience that could be seen through, say, a video camera? Now, this is different than, say, an evaluation, because an evaluation is you are placing a judgment on the situation, whatever that situation is, even if that situation is you remembering something you did. The memory, in other words, is your observation. So an example of an observation can be, Nancy said, I don't want to work here anymore. So imagine you have a friend, Nancy, she comes up to you and you're at work and she says, I don't want to work here anymore. That's the observation. Nancy said, quote. Another one can be, a guy named Brian Smith has not scored a goal in 10 games. That's not, you're not evaluating Brian. You're not saying he's a terrible soccer player. You are merely observing what happened. So this is different than an evaluation, because let's say that Nancy says to you in a very annoyed voice, there's your evaluation. I don't want to work here anymore. The evaluating is, she said this in a particular way that you are inscribing onto the situation, when really she just said, I don't want to work here anymore. Another evaluation is, Brian Smith is a terrible soccer player. He hasn't scored a goal. So the terrible soccer player, it's an evaluation. You're judging him. So those are the differences. Now, let's get to the feelings and needs, which people confuse, which I get. So a feeling is different than a thought. And I say that because Rosenberg differentiates faux feelings, F-A-U-X, the French faux, with feelings. And feelings are, you know, happy, sad, excited, bored, determined, angry, horrified. Faux feelings, which are thoughts we're telling ourselves about a situation, which we may have feelings because of those thoughts. Faux feelings can be anything like betrayed, abused, misunderstood, ignored, attacked, bullied, interrupted, pressured, used, unwanted. Those are faux feelings. And so we can say, I am thinking that I'm being ignored, and therefore I am feeling whatever you're feeling. Maybe you're annoyed, maybe you're angry, maybe you're worried, maybe you're confused, but ignored is not your feeling, it is your thought about the feeling. So needs, also wants, desires, wishes, values, can be things like, and I'm not giving an exhaustive list, you can read all the NVC books and you'll see that there's like 101 of these, but some include autonomy, celebration, integrity. By integrity, I can mean authenticity, creativity, meaning. There are like needs within needs. And often in NVC trainings, you're taught about layers of needs, that under a need is another one, another one, another one. And that helps you become more conscious of, again, what's going on for you or somebody else. So keep that in mind too. Some other needs can be fun, laughter, physical nurturance, like air, food, shelter, protection from life-threatening forms, viruses. You know, we need protection from viruses and other parasitic-like things that exist, bacteria, you know, those kinds of things. Those are some needs. And again, it's not an exhaustive list. I'm giving you like a sampling of a sampling. But these are things that, according to Rosenberg, are quite universal. I have seen the argument that the needs as universal is invalidated because it can be culture specific. And I think that's something we want to take into consideration, is that the way that Americans or those in the West define a need, it may be different than other cultures and other societies where their understanding of a need could be something completely unrelated to what I'm thinking it is, in which case, let's talk about it. That's how we build understanding, which this is kind of what this is all about. So now the last part, the last and fourth aspect of this is the request that we make. So we figured out our need. Let's say we need safety. Let's just say we need safety and we want to go about getting it. And we can do this in two ways. Rosenberg says you can make a request or you can make a demand. Now, the difference is when you make a request, you are allowing for the other person or the other party with which you are communicating to say no, to say, you know what, I get it, you need XYZ. However, I'm not able to give that to you for whatever reason. That's the request. And the request, when you make it of others, you allow for the possibility that that request can be met through other ways. You can find an infinite ability to get that request. Now, sometimes the request, you may think, I need this done in a time frame, but part of the request making versus a demand is you will allow for the possibility that, okay, I may not be able to get this request met within 5 minutes. Maybe it'll happen in 10, maybe it'll happen in a day. But the point is you are asking really for the willingness of the other to meet or not meet the request. And part of the dialogue is, and this is something you address in the much more intensive NVC trainings, is what is the capacity of the other person? What is your own capacity? Like, and by capacity, I mean, do you have the resources in or out or both to meet the need? Or is it like, you know what, I can't do this right now. I can't handle this right now. Or the other person may say to you, I get it, you're struggling, but the only thing I can give you is a link to something, but I can't physically be the one to help you getting your need met. That's request language. Demand language, on the other hand, is, can you do this for me? With no allowance of the other person to say, I can't do that right now, or I can't, in whatever way, answer your request. If somebody says, and we probably have all been here, where someone will say, it's usually maybe a boss or a manager, please send out the email by 4 o'clock, or please do this by this time. Now, it's a little complicated because, of course, when you're in a work situation, you typically understand the parameters within which you work. However, I do want to allow for the fact that people should still have choice at work. You should still be able to say, okay, I have 5 deadlines, yours is 1 of 5. I can get it out at 4:05 p.m., maybe not 4, and that's the dialogue. That's your opportunity to talk. But anyway, I just wanted to give an example of what a demand is versus request. And so really implied in a demand is this resounding yes, no matter what. You will do what I say, no matter what, no matter the cost to you, no matter the cost to this company, this organization, whatever. That's this implied, unspoken energy within a demand, which is why Rosenberg says, let's make requests, because people should be able to say no. They should be able to say, okay, I want to help you. I want to find a way to support you. However, this is the only thing I can do in order to do that. That should be allowed. And that's what NVC teaches, is that it is allowed and encouraged. So that's the difference between requests and demands. So why is this important? This is important because it challenges the way that we've been educated to think about communication, at least in our culture. According to theologian Walter Wink, from which Rosenberg gets a lot of his ideas, Walter Wink argues that there are the powers that be. And there's a book called The Powers That Be. I have it. If you want to borrow it, let me know. Essentially, there are ways in which societies have formed that then inform the way that we think about our relationship to each other and to the greater society. And unfortunately, what Walter Wink says, we have been basing a lot of our society on this idea of a binary good, bad, right, wrong. You know, male and female is the only two genders that exist. And out of this comes a hierarchy thinking. And so Rosenberg wants to challenge this and say, okay, what if we communicated with one another that allowed us to live in the society, allowed us to live within some pretty unjust systems that we should have the power to dismantle collectively? And how can we communicate in this society where, essentially, to use rather simplistic language, nobody loses? It's not a win-lose game. It is not a zero-sum game. Walter Wink writes about the fact that our society has been basically created as a very zero-sum game. If you don't have the resources, if you don't have the power, if you're not of the fill in the blank, right, fill in the blank, you therefore will suffer. And Rosenberg wants to say, wait, we don't have to live that way. There is an other way where we can interact with one another, to say nothing of how we interact with non-human living beings. How do we interact with animals? I'm not saying you're like using NVC with an animal, but the way we're thinking about the world we live changes. Because now we have this consciousness, we have this ability to say, okay, I am really wanting or valuing XYZ, and I'd like to find a way to go about getting that. And how can I do that at no one's expense? And I think that's what's really crucial here, is NVC is literally never at anybody's expense. That's important in navigating complicated conflicts, because so much of how we're thinking about conflict is a very me versus you, my side versus your side, who's right, who's wrong, when we know life is more complicated than that. We know that people's lives are more complicated than the simple, oh, well, you know, it's all down to one policy, and if the policy were just changed, everything would be better. We know it's not that simple. So NVC hopefully can help us in navigating these conversations, because now we can say, all right, as I'm hearing, say, this person talk about a really, really horrible, violent issue, you can then figure out what's going on for you, and also have the conversation, what's going on for them. How, you know, after you've done your own, I guess, self-empathy, you can then say to the person, so what's going on for you? And they might say, you know, I really, really, really get worried when bombs are dropped on cities all across the nation and food is denied to large groups of people and there's forced migration. They're worried. They want people to have the food they need. They want people to have the safety they need. Those are your needs. The food, the peace of mind, knowing that people will be treated with care. And that's your empathy, is you can acknowledge that, because hopefully NVC can give us a framework with which to do that. Now, obviously, I know I presented NVC as a framework, and in the beginning, when people are first learning it, it's helpful. It's kind of like the grammar of a language. In fact, Marshall Rosenberg even calls NVC the language of life. So we can kind of think about it that way. Obviously, as one gets more familiar with it, you know, you're not really thinking about it as a framework. You're just thinking about it as the way that you communicate, the way you live, the way you think. And so That's all I've got for you today. I welcome your questions, comments, elaborations, whatever you want to say. Thank you, and there you go.
All right, does anybody have questions for Darya?
Yeah, Audrey does.
Okay, Audrey.
Hi, Darya. Thank you so much. That was really interesting. So in Rosenberg's framework, would a demand be considered violent?
What was that question in this framework? What?
Would a demand be considered violent?
Yeah, he would say that is a violent way of asking for what you want. Craig Ali?
Yeah, I'm wondering when we talk about demands and requests. Well, let me preface it by saying much of uh, nonviolent communication starts with an assertion or an intent, and there are groups that demonstrate peacefully but are still met with violence. And I'm wondering just what kind of scenario or strategy could be invoked to address an aftermath for future purposes. Because, as I say, a demand is a violent way to suggest something. Generally, it's been my experience when demands are made, it's because a previous relationship or a relationship already exists to where a lot of people don't feel they have a choice in how to, achieve their goal. And I'm wondering just how that factors into, how to move forward in terms of communicating with people.
Yeah, good question. So that touches on another aspect of NVC, which is protective use of force, where you will sometimes, should you choose it, and assuming you will, there are going to be times where people or groups of people are going to have to do things to protect themselves in violent situations. Now, protective use of force this is where Rosenberg gets into the difference between punitive action and protective action, because we can do things that use, and by force I mean there's a spectrum. The force can be you block a number on your phone because you can't deal with the way someone is interacting with you, all the way to more violent, should we say, uses of force, such as sanctions on a country, such as, for example, in World War II, unfortunately, this did not succeed, but in, I think it was the Netherlands, people knew that Nazi, there were, I just want to make sure I get it right. The people in the Netherlands knew that Nazi officials had ways of getting into the country by train, and so what they would do is they would literally blow up using bombs. They'd blow up the train tracks to prevent the Nazis from getting in. That's a form of protective use of force. They were protecting their country by a very violent, threatening force, and they didn't, there was no dialogue. And sometimes you do have to do that. We see this in almost every nonviolent movement in history, where you often have to go to some extreme measure to protect, and that's differentiated from punishment, because punishment says, I'm going to do something to willingly cause harm on you. Protection is, I'm not causing you personal harm, I am protecting myself or this group of people.
Mm.
And that's a very, very, very important distinction that people learn within NVC trainings. And it's doubly important because sometimes when talking about nonviolence, this assumption goes, oh, it's all about being kind. It's all about being wishy-washy. It's not. It's about a radical form of compassion that does not allow for the exploitation of anyone. And sometimes to prevent exploitation in any form, we have to get kind of forceful. We have to make some really hard decisions. Does that answer your question? Joanne?
Yeah,
Oh, sorry.
I get the sense that there is a strategy in
Yes,
that within that framework.
yes. Joanne?
Yes, so it is nonviolent communication mostly relating to an arena of mediation, let's say. Because how we talk to each other day by day, it's not always out of need necessarily. But if there's a need for mediation, then that makes it clearer in my mind that would be the primary motivation.
Well, NVC can be used in mediation, certainly. But nonviolent communication, at least as Rosenberg is defining it, is really just a way of communicating in any and every situation. And while, I mean, I would argue that every time we say anything or anytime we do anything, it is out of a need, whether or not we say it. I may not have to say I need safety when I lock my doors at night, but what I'm telling myself is, okay, I would like some safety. I'm going to lock my door because that gives me a sense of safety. But yeah, our communication is the way we communicate. And NVC is another framework in how to communicate, be it mediation in a more conventional sense or just communicating, period.
Uh-huh. I guess. Yeah, I guess I have trouble with the word need. I mean, I guess what you're trying to do is balance your need to be heard against the other person's need to be heard, certainly, but also just in most conversations I have, I'm not operating out of a sense of need. I just have trouble with the word, I guess.
Okay, think of it as, instead of need, maybe think of it as, what do you value? What are you wanting out of something? What is your underlying wish? I know need is a tough one, and I've heard a lot of other people in other arenas say how troubling for some reason the word need is. But there are a lot of other words that mean the same thing, but also it's sort of, I think need is one word, but Rosenberg is thinking of it as an umbrella term that has many other terms that I'm trying to find a way to like best explain it. Let me think about that and get back to you.
Yeah, I think what it is maybe is that that it comes in handy in any conversation, even just a casual conversation with a friend, if you start feeling uncomfortable, or if you start feeling that something's going sideways or whatever, then you have to pay attention to what's being triggered in you and what you need to do to respond to that.
Yeah.
But if it's just hanging out, you know. it's not-
Oh, well, yeah. I mean, yeah, I see what you're saying.
Yeah, I think nonviolent communication, just the name of it indicates that you're in a situation where there isn't agreement possibly, or there isn't there is some issue, some problem that needs to be solved. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I have more to say, but I can call you separately.
Okay.
I think Bob was next, or yeah, Bob.
Okay. Actually, I had one thing to say already, and now I feel I can say something about the need topic, because I remember my training in NVC a while back. But first of all, I want to endorse this. I want to say there's so much. I think one of the great things about the nonviolent communication approach is that it sort of saves people from so much unnecessary difficulty in relationships. It helps us, you know, like say a married couple. I sometimes think about the fact in high school, we didn't have lessons in anything like nonviolent communication. We just sort of picked up the way our parents communicated, which may have or may not have been very helpful, you know. But there are techniques that can be consciously utilized to minimize strife and hurt feelings and anger, and you know, and I wish more people could get that kind of training. And I think NVC is one of a really well thought out approach that almost anyone could benefit from. With respect to needs, one thing I remember is that one way this term came up in discussing nonviolent communication has to do with this, that we tend to, a lot of people will tend to say, okay, what you did just really made me angry. And if you put it that way, it sort of suggests a kind of false binary whereby one person was purely the perpetrator and one person was purely the victim, whereas what you're denying is that the person who got their feelings hurt brings something into the situation themselves. In other words, let's suppose that, well, I see Craig on the screen right now. Suppose Craig disagreed with me and it hurt my feelings. Well, it might be because I was very closed-minded and not very receptive to a perfectly great idea that Craig had. So in other words, the hurt came not just from what Craig did, but from what I brought into the situation, which might be irritation, or maybe I've had a hard day and I'm feeling very sensitive. So by asking, what do I need? I might say, well, I needed a little peace and quiet, or, you know, when you said that, I felt sort of angry, and the anger came from my need for wanting some peace and quiet in my life or something like that. You know, we're not always thinking about our needs, but it is important to ask ourselves, you know, what did we bring into a situation that contributed to the way we felt about someone else's actions?
Yeah, which is why I stressed the idea that what we tell ourselves about a situation influences how we're thinking about it and how we're talking about it and expressing it. Because, like you said, we bring a lot to every situation that we're in. And, you know, today's talk didn't have time to go through all the minutiae of NVC, but one large part of it is the role of taking responsibility for your own thoughts, for your own feelings, for all the things you bring to something, which will influence that empathy, self-empathy conversation. So, yeah.
So a lot of what NVC does, I think, is it prevents us from feeling unnecessary hurt, and it
Yeah.
prevents us from causing unnecessary hurt.
Yeah.
It's
I
hurt.
would agree.
It reduces hurt in the world. That's a great thing.
Mm-hmm. Janet or Virginia and then Bonnie.
Yeah, I want to also say that I agree that it's worthwhile. And when it's one time I tried it in a situation where whatever I was saying, I've said so many times before. And I tried to talk about, wait a minute, what am I needing right now? And I felt weird saying it because it wasn't normal for me. I'm acting like this. I sort of,
Yeah,
and
right.
the response was completely different than normal because I had actually, and it actually worked. And I'm like, whoa, that actually worked. It was so weird. And, but I just also want to talk about the need of that Joanne was talking about, because like, I think like if you're talking about, you ask somebody, well, you want to go to lunch with me? And they say no, and you get really upset and you don't know, you really didn't give them the option to say no. And then you need to look at yourself and say, well, what did I need in that situation? I needed connection, and I needed whatever it was I needed, and I could go back to them and say, well, I really need to be connected to you. We don't have to do it at lunchtime, but maybe we could, you know, if you were in touch with what you actually needed when you said that. But if the person just says yes, then you're not going to think about your needs. You know, like,
Right.
you're not going to be like, everything you do is not going to be about, or if you're like in a planning meeting and you're just planning and you're making dates or whatever. But it's when something doesn't happen correctly, or, you know, then that's when you need to think, wait a sec, what was I expecting, and why was I expecting that? And
Yeah.
what's the matter with me? Yeah. Anyway, I think it's very helpful and hard to do when you're, you know, you do it a different way.
Oh, yeah. Oh, it's a total paradigm shift. And it took me a very long time to completely transform the way that I was thinking and communicating. I mean, now I feel like I can't go back, but yeah, it's a completely, because again, it's the opposite of what Walter Wink is saying, of like, we were educated to believe X and Y and Z, and now Rosenberg is saying, well, what if we kind of looked at this like way differently? Yeah. Bonnie? And then Bob?
Okay, maybe I'm getting ahead of the game here, but how does Marshall suggest, or any of the NVC teachers, when somebody blames you for their stress, you're stressing me out, you're always complaining, I can't deal with this, I've gotten that, and blaming me for their feelings. And I can sure counter, yeah, I know it's a stressful situation, I get that. But continue blaming me for their stress, their anger, their frustration, when all I have done is stated that there's a problem.
Yeah,
And I swear to you, this is a real life story.
yeah.
Huh.
Yeah, thanks for asking that. That's wonderful. So in situations like that, where what I'm sensing is that this is not just like one thing, but there is a lot here. They're basically saying to you that all of their feelings and all of their anger, they're trying to put on you, and then you said, "Oh, you're always complaining," and this and this and this. So it's like 5 situations in one. So what Marshall would say is, first, number 1, he would say, what is your self-empathy? Let's look at one sub-example of the whole picture you gave me. Let's look at you're always complaining, just for the sake of argument. If someone says you are always complaining, your self-empathy can be, okay, I'm hearing them say that I'm always complaining. That's the observation. They are saying this. And then, I would imagine your feeling is like, annoyed. I mean, what is it? I mean, we can do like a quick example. What is the feeling? If someone says you are always complaining, what's your feeling?
You're
Are you
asking me?
Yeah. Are you angry? Are you frustrated? Are you pissed?
Startled.
Startled. Okay. You're startled. And so I imagine that you are wanting or needing or valuing what?
Understanding of the problem,
Okay, let's go with
the
understanding.
practical problem, and understanding that in the beginning of conversation, I was just trying to help.
Right. So you're wanting understanding
Not
and
demanding nothing, just giving the facts and saying this is
Yeah.
what's going on.
this is what's going on. Okay. And so then the request is either going to be of yourself to yourself, which in this case, it may need to be you asking yourself what it is you want to do in order to either make peace within yourself about needing that understanding for relaying of facts that could help this person, or it could be towards them. Now, I imagine that if this other person is already coming at you with this level of intensity, I'm not so convinced that in this moment they're going to be willing to hear you say, hey, that's startling. I'd really like some understanding for the fact that I'm really trying to help you out here. I'm not so convinced that they're going to be willing to hear that, although I could be wrong.
Correct.
But let's imagine for a second they're not ready to hear that. So I know.
You know who I'm talking about, I
I do
think.
know what you're talking about. But to be fair, anybody, there are tons of people who could react that way.
Sure.
So then your self-empathy would look like, okay, I really, really would love it if I had this understanding. Okay, it may not happen right now. This is what you're gonna like tell yourself. This is your self-empathy. And as you're going through that process of like, I just really wanted to help this person. I had ideas that could help them. I that's all I wanted. That may be one step in the healing process because you're giving yourself that understanding effectively.
Yeah.
Now, after you've done that and you're totally clear, you're like, I know what I wanted. I wanted to help this person. They're not able to hear me right now. Then, and only then, would you give either a silent empathy where like you're telling yourself your empathy for the other person, or you could tell them. Now, let's imagine real quick that the person is not willing to hear your empathy for them. Believe it or not, that happens. People may not always be receptive to our empathy. That doesn't mean we don't give it silently. We can think to ourselves, or we could write out in our journal or whatever. I wonder if this person was really whatever. Were they mad? Were they upset? Were they this, that? What could they be needing? That's your empathy for them. And in that process, even if it's silent, and by silent, I mean you're literally thinking it to yourself, or maybe you're writing it down, or whatever you do, that process alone could help heal the situation, in that you kind of come to a peace about the situation, knowing, okay, at this time, because every moment's going to be different, but at this time, I can just give this person empathy. I can give myself empathy, and I can just move forward with the understanding that the person that I'm communicating with may not be in a place where they can really take in what I'm saying. And so you're going to navigate those situations differently. Now, you could try and have the conversation with the person. You never know. It may be that as long as you know this person, they're just never going to be able to hear what you have to say, in which case you have a decision. Do you continue talking to this person? Now, sometimes you have to. Sometimes they're a landlord, they're a boss, they're whatever, and there's no other option. You can't move, you can't quit, you can't, there may be factors that determine where you are. In that case, the process is going to be making peace within yourself. I know there have been situations in my life where there are people where I would really love if they understood how I was feeling and what I needed and all this stuff, but I know they are not ready to hear me. So I have to make peace in myself about it. Does that help you?
Yeah, well, just the reminders. Yeah,
Okay.
thank you. And just to carry on and, you know, life goes on.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh,
All right. Who was next? Was it
thank
Craig?
you.
Bonnie. Was it, who was next?
I think Bob was,
Oh, Bob?
saw his hand go up, I think.
Okay. I'm not hearing anything. Oh, y'all are muted.
I've been trying to unraise that hand, but
Oh, okay.
consider me satisfied. I have to leave, but thank you so much, Darya. This has been great.
You're welcome.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye. Okay. Craig, are you next?
Yeah, I want to go back to something Bob had said, because, and it brings, I think, a very, I guess you could say, poignant idea for the need of what it is we have here. And he talked about essentially how we communicated with each other growing up. Now, when my brother graduated from high school, school shootings would have been unheard of. And when I graduated from high school, where I graduated from high school, school shootings would have been pretty much unheard of. Yeah, we had one, and it was based on an incident. But by the time I graduated, you know, school shootings would have been an impetus for a gang initiation. One of the causes for a school shooting could have been a gang initiation. And so I say that we're talking about a period of 7 years between my brother's graduation and mine, from high school and mine. And I'm really wondering specifically just how much of a factor and a necessary thing that institutions envelop this idea and the strategy of NVC with respect to when you had school shootings. The idea was to bring in more police, school police, and not address any of the factors as to what caused the issue to begin with in the first place. And so I'm wondering, I guess it's a preaching to the choir question, but I'm wondering if in that study they had opened up that possibility to where we can think macro as opposed to micro, and institutions could adopt some of what it is you're saying in that in within the study?
Yeah, good question. I think that whether an institution, in this case, a school, an educational system, whether or not the powers that be, literally to quote Walter Rink, whether they choose to adopt NVC strategy is dependent on whether they know about it and whether they see, hopefully, the benefit of it. I think sadly, NVC, while it is known, while people know about it, while institutions know about it, I think it's not mainstream enough. And I think that's because it's really hard to convince institutions in this case, which are made up of people, of changing the way that they operate. And, like Walter Rink says, Rosenberg echoes, our societies, especially here in America, are so based in punitive, hierarchical, racist, punitive systems of modes of operation that to flip the script, so to speak, to introduce NVC into the framework in which how we are navigating school conflicts, how are we navigating racism on a campus, how are we navigating the way we think about gangs. It's really hard. It's not impossible. It will take time. It will take a lot of resources. It will take hopefully a group of NVC trainers who are hopefully at their core anti-racist to say this is what schools need, and trainers will have to work together collaboratively and say and present to school boards and present to other places of educational authority and say it's not enough for this to be a book in your library. This needs to be a part of the way in which you run your school. And that is not going to come from one person. That is going to come from a group of people. And I could get into why I decided not to get my training official and become a certified trainer. But it is related to this lack of very anti-racist activism, because Rosenberg develops NVC out of a very racist incident. He develops this in reaction to racism. He develops this in a time where he was trying to make sense of the very real systemic racism that existed not only in Detroit, but our world, America, but our world. So it's going to take a while, but it's going to take a lot of teamwork. It's going to take a lot of effort. And speaking of, preaching to the choir, I encourage you to read Father Greg Boyle's book, Barking to the Choir. It's an amazing book. And so is his first book, Tattoos on the Heart, but he addresses how to think about gangs and how do we not only rehabilitate, but heal. So that's just a little side note, but thanks for your question. It's so important.
Good to see you. And yeah.
Goodbye, everybody. Who wants to
Okay.
stick around a little bit? Just 10 minutes.
Bye. Thank you, Darya. It's great.
Thank you.